to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And this week, I'm excited to welcome two people onto the program, Natalia Schwien Scott, Rachel Petersen. Both of you, big thanks for being here.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sam.
Sam. Yeah, happy to be here.
People might already be familiar with you because you both co-founded an amazing initiative, the Thinking with Plants and Fungi initiative at Harvard with the Center for the Study of World Religions. And recently in May, you had a conference with amazing people, amazing talks. And so I have you both here to talk about that. Also, I'm doing separate episodes where I get to talk to each of you individually because you both do such amazing work. But aside from the work you do outside of this, I wanted one episode where we just talk about what this initiative is about. So, um, ideally, you talk out of turn and we talk over each other because that's fun for me. Uh, and some people say I'm interrupting. I'm like, no, it's fun just to talk over each other. That's just how normal speech is. So, does one of you want to start talking about where did this idea come from to even start this initiative? Was it one of you? Was there some advisor or colleague who was kind of pushing you to do this? Because I know there's plenty of things. I didn't start this podcast of my own free will. I was pushed to do it by other people, namely Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm at the Forum on Religious Ecology. And they're like, "You're young, you know podcasts, start one." And I'm like, I actually don't know anything about it. But in the meantime, I've really fell in love with it. So, how did this initiative even start?
Rachel, do you want to dive in?
Sure. I feel like origin stories are always apocryphal, right? Like everyone has their own version. So well, maybe there's any number of origin stories that one could give for this initiative, but I would say it arose somewhat organically with some prompting. Um, Charles Stang, Professor Charles Stang, is the head of the Center for the Study of World Religions, and he had started an initiative called Transcendence and Transformation at the CSWR, which was it's committed to sort of looking at different religious and spiritual modes of contemplation, mysticism, esotericism, and thinking about how these practices and theories take us beyond the boundaries of how we conventionally think about the self and how that might transform us. And he had just, I think, happened to read a few years ago the book, The Life of Plants, A Metaphysics of Mixture by
Mm.
Emmanuel Ecology. And you might think, well, okay, mysticism, esotericism, and then a book on plants, like that doesn't really relate. But if you read this book by Ecology, it's all about how attending to plant life can radically alter our metaphysics. And I think Charles, having known me as a student advisee and Natalia as well. Natalia did her MTS at Harvard and I did my MDiv. He had this intuition that the two of us might connect and might be interested to explore this topic of plants and fungi in the more than human world and how that related to these questions about consciousness and transcendence and these things. So he sort of prompted us to start a very humble reading group at the CSWR. And that's really how this began with the reading group that Natalia and I co-convened, gosh, 2020. What was the first year we did it, Natalia? 2020?
2022. Yeah, 3 years of
2020.
this.
Yeah. And maybe I'll let Natalia talk more about, I don't know, the reading group or kind of give some shape to what I just said.
Oh, I think that was beautifully put, Rachel. It was, yeah, I mean, Charles had a wonderful instinct. I think that this was, Rachel and I have slightly, have different backgrounds in what we've studied and what our areas of interests are. But the convening place is thinking about mind in the more than human worlds and again, in different spaces, but in ways that beautifully intersect. And it just was such an inspiring relief to meet Rachel and to start talking about how many books and articles there already were to start with, an overwhelming amount of material that we could consider from different disciplines. And how did we want to structure that for perhaps students or community members who were new to this space to thinking about mind in the more than human world? And so Yeah, I mean, Rachel and I sat down. We had some initial books that we knew we wanted to cover, and some initial scholars that we were really excited about, including having Kochia be central. And Rachel had also worked with a variety of scholars in these spaces. I had worked with a variety of scholars in these spaces, but different ones. And so that was exciting too, to say, oh, I know this person from this realm, she knows this person from that realm. What if we put them in conversation with each other? And so we just built this syllabus over the course of the past 3 years that looked at all these different ways in which to think about mind in plants, but also looking at how the current conversations around plant intelligence and plant sentience reflect earlier conversations that have been had around non-human animal intelligence and sentience, or
Right.
what are perspectives, cultural perspectives that come from indigenous communities or from communities that may not label themselves as indigenous or identify as indigenous, but have these relational landscapes. Or what was poetry coming out of the space? We read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest. So we tried to explore what are these different pathways into uh, thinking about mind in the more than human, and specifically with plants and fungi. So yeah, it did happen quite uh, organically, to quite plant-like in many ways. So it sort of unfolded into this beautiful community that ended up being quite interdisciplinary. I think is a good way of putting it. Is that not only were the readings very interdisciplinary, and I think an example of that is that we read Zoe Schlanger's The Light Eaters together at the beginning of this past academic year. And as we went through, I went through every chapter and pulled out all of the material she's referencing, and then chose from that material selections of that to read. So we were reading the studies that she's exploring. We were reading the primary sources on these different things that she was talking about. And that really led to, not only was the group of people sitting around the table interdisciplinary, but the material and the group. And so you just had these incredibly different perspectives, but they all, again, sort of similar to me and Rachel, sat in conversation around like, what's happening with plants? Like, what's going on here? Why are we so excited about this? And how does this change our perception of the way we move through the world? So I hope that that's a helpful framing for how this developed. Rachel, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was a perfect summation. No, no, that's it. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about that Frederick Buechner quote, how like calling is when your deepest gladness meets the world's deepest hunger. And
Oh,
like that first year, like especially that first year was a really
yeah.
special I think Natalia and I were probably both really overwhelmed by the commitment and engagement we had from the community from so many different departments, early career scholars, students. Michael Pollan joined for a little bit. David Abram joined as a visiting scholar. So really, but we all kind of met on a similar level, which I think was a really encouraging thing to see in community. Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it. It was really special.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really like the ideal reading group. I also like the method of read a book, and if you like that book, read all of the things cited in the book.
Yeah.
And then when you read those things and read the things they're citing, and after a while, you've read everything that's ever been written, really.
Mhm.
Uh, and so I know some of the things that I've gotten the most out of, that's exactly what happened, where you like, this is an amazing book. So you read the stuff there. It's like if you have a friend that you really like, they're like, let me introduce you to my friends. And then all of a sudden you have all these friends. Um, and yeah, very cool for folks like Michael Pollan and David Abram to join. Um, you know, it's kind of a separate question. More than human world, right? David Abram, more than
Mhm.
human. People say this all the time. Uh, do you both use that word a lot? Where's everybody at with more than human?
I do, although I'm laughing. Natalia knows this. I have a very large bumper sticker on my car,
Oh,
and it says
very large.
it's large. It's
And beautiful. Say it loud, say it proud.
It says find non-human teachers. And it's from a cool it's more than a plant store. It's called the Cactus Store in LA, and they sell plants, but they also do like a lot of like community work around the questions that we care about, the initiative. Um and I'll return back to your question, but it's that bumper sticker has been a really interesting Rorschach test because when I
Hmm.
say like non-human teachers, some people see it and they think the way that I think I initially meant it, which was, plants, animals, fungi, lichen, the living world, right? Other people have seen it and told me they thought I meant angels, deities, entities,
Oh.
ghosts. And then other people, like my older brother, who's a coder, saw it and thought that I wanted to replace school teachers with AI. And And I think
Interesting.
I think what's I use the more than human world rather than non-human because even though my bumper sticker says non-human, because I think more than human is a gesture towards something that is attempting to be anti-anthropocentric. So it's
Hmm.
not that they're just like we're defining non-human beings by the fact that they're not human. It's a sort of negational framing, but more than human is a gesture towards greatness, like a greater something
Hmm.
that exceeds the categories of the human in important ways. So I use it and I feel like it's becoming more and more common to hear it, and thus
Hmm.
it's a little less kind of like wonky to hear it. And personally, being situated in a divinity school, I actually really like that the more than human could also accommodate for entities, deities,
Yeah.
ghosts, spiritual beings. Like I don't want to just situate it to the terrestrial.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that quite hasn't quite happened yet. It's still sort of indexed to kind of a terrestrial consideration. But I don't know, Natalia. Do you like it's picking up more currency? That's my
Oh,
sense. But
I think you said all of that so well, Rachel. Thank you. I don't know how much more I have to add. I would say that I use non-human in my writing more. When I'm
Hmm.
specifically talking about other animals, I'll use non-human
Hmm.
animal a lot, or just non-humans. And that I think for me, that's a way to uh not again to echo Rachel, to not negate, but rather to make a connection between the two, but to articulate that there has been historically in a Western, whatever we want to call Western, that can mean a lot of different things. I don't like to use that term, so I don't know why I just said it, but just this like post-European, the this like frame of human has been so powerful, the speciesism. So by using non-human, I'm both gesturing at how um, illogical the speciesism is
Hmm.
in this paradigm, but also and in the methodologies that come out of it, the research methodologies that come out of it, but also the other side of it, which is to say, like we there are similarities and differences. We're in this field of existence of embodiment or non-embodiment, this sort of field of capacities. And so to say a non-human animal allows me to then also say a human animal. And that is helpful for me. But I really like how Rachel put this, like more than human is in a broader sense. I think gestures really beautifully to an attempt at decentering the human from what the world is. But I think also with Rachel's last point is such an interesting point. And to reference someone that I talk about in our conversation, Sam, who Rachel has heard me reference so many times because I'm obsessed with him, Robert Kirk, 17th century Episcopalian minister in the Scottish Highlands, who was applying Neoplatonism to the Scottish Highlander cosmology. He says this really interesting thing where he says that second sight and fairies and other aspects of the supernatural world that were present within the cosmology, that it is inherently tied to the land. That when you leave the land, when Scottish people leave Scotland, they no longer have the capacity to have second sight.
Hmm.
Somehow it is tied to the landscape. And he makes the argument that every country has this. He says it much more beautifully and eloquently and in 17th century language of saying like every country and has the basically he's making this argument that everybody has daemons and that there's this relationship between land and spirit. and that is regionally specific and culturally specific. But he says it in
Hmm.
this really interesting way, specifically about fairy culture and all of the different, supernatural capacities that are related to fairy culture. So I think that's something that Rachel and I have talked about, looking at. We also talked a lot about rock consciousness, if we were going to do
Hmm.
like a month devoted to rocks. And I still, wish that we had more time for that. Maybe we'll do that at another Thinking with Rocks conference someday. But I would say that in like interspecies dialogues, the other conversation group that's under the program for the evolution of spirituality, run by Dan McCannon at the Divinity School, we have included regularly, despite that we mostly talk about non-human animals, and we do talk about plants and fungi and other beings. We've also had plenty of conversations about matters of spirit
Hmm.
and how that fits within this more than human gesture. So I hope that's helpful because I think Rachel and I have somewhat similar ways of thinking about this.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I really appreciate that Sami's like more than human, non-human teachers. So you mean robots?
Yeah.
AI, right? Like, oh no. Uh, they can be part of the conversation, but that wasn't where I was going with it. And yeah, I would love to see a Thinking with Rocks conference. That's amazing. I've only recently been getting into Marsha Bjornrud's work in that regard, and just amazing, especially when you think historically, for people like Aristotle, and it's like stone is just the bottom of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Even amongst the, supposedly inanimate elements, like at least fire and air and water are moving around. And then
Mm.
stone is just like the worst. And then, of course, contemporary geologists are like, "Are you kidding me? Stone is amazing and has so much wisdom in it."
Mm.
So yeah, so let's get that going. I try to give people homework all the time, so make that conference happen. Along those lines, I got to hear, how was the conference? I wasn't able to attend in person or online, and but was super curious about it because this is just one of my favorite areas of inquiry. So I wonder if you could give us a summary of some of the highlights. Did it work? Did it didn't work? Was it a total disaster? From everything I've heard from people who attended, it was pretty amazing. Obviously you can't summarize all of it, but what were some highlights for the two of you?
Mm.
You want to start, Natalia?
Oh, I can try. It's there's so much. Um, it was so special. I think one of the things that's been, I think, quite special about the last year of the program, as opposed to our first 2 years when Rachel and I were working together on the reading group. But in the last year since Rachel graduated with her MDiv, she took on the program lead position, and she really just brought this expertise of organizing people and her incredible organizational skills and thoughtfulness and as a leader in a
Hmm.
program. And I just saw it so perfectly executed within this very large and what could have been a very um, sprawling conference. But it I think the way in which um, under her leadership with me as an advisor on continuing to run the reading group and as an advisor on the initiative, and then our colleague Russ Powell, who's also
Oh, yeah.
been integral to the development of the how we to our program on the administrative side, and are also our colleague Elitsa Koeva, who's been our postdoc on the program for the last year. That it was really wonderful to see how much space there was in the conference, which were very packed days, but how much space there was for conversation between people and
Mm.
how much room there was for just this, like, again, probably use this word too often, but just this like interdisciplinary picking in a good way. Like there was so many opportunities for people from different fields to ask questions of one another or to sit next to each other or to have lunch or to grab a coffee. There was space in a way that there doesn't always feel at conferences. And I think something that we did really well as a team with Rachel at the helm was to not pack talks on top of talks. And so
Right.
that gave space. And everyone attended everyone's talks. There wasn't this sense of that you only went to your own talk and then you disappeared. People came to each other's things, and that was so precious. And I just don't think you get to see that so often
Yeah.
at conferences. And so I think, yeah, to me, that was like, besides that the talks were wonderful, the real highlight, I think, was the community. And that our reading group, so many people who have been attending over the last couple of years came to the talks or came to Alitza's art exhibition in the evening and supported her, or like stayed to help with cleaning up or stayed to move around Monica Gagliano's yarn in the room for the last thing. So I'll leave it there, but just it was so precious. It was really
That's
precious.
great.
Oh, thank you for those kind words. And yeah, it was a huge team effort and not something I think I'm going to do for another 10 years. It was a lot of work for everyone. And I think I'll echo some of the highlights that Natalia mentioned in terms of like the interaction, and then I'll also add some more like thematic or specific kind of talks that really stayed with me. But just to echo, yeah, I mean, there's so much lip service to interdisciplinarity, and it's one of these things that I'm as a sort of like chronic dilettante or someone who's lived many lives, I'm really interested in it and how to do it well. And I actually think there's very few models for how to do it well. I'm not saying we did it well, but I think I did get feedback from many people that the conference was like pitched at a level where people could talk to each other.
Mm,
I think there's a risk it goes too specialized and thus you can't talk across silos, or it's so watered down that you're not talking about anything of substance.
yeah.
And a huge highlight for me to that end, we were so nervous we wouldn't be able to get any scientists, and we really wanted there to be scientists. We didn't want this to be viewed as this kind of hand wavy, philosophical, speculative, whatever. And so we were so lucky to get Zoe Schlanger to agree. We basically reached out to her and we were like, look, you know all these scientists from your book. Like, what's your dream panel? Like, who would you want to come speak on a panel? And so she put that panel together with Liz von Falkenberg, who sort of like OG, like helped create the field of plant neurobiology, and Ernesto Giannoli, who famously discovered this plant in South America that mimics other plants.
Mm,
And their panel was fantastic because it was really fun to see people at the forefront of these questions of the boundaries of science, like what is science, what is not science, and how do we come to know otherness? Like, how do we come to know these radically different beings? And is science well suited for that? And how is it well suited? How is it not well
mm,
suited? They were also really funny, and that was such a surprise. And I remember going up to them and saying, gosh, thank you for doing this. I didn't think you'd accept coming to a divinity school. And they were like, actually, that was the main draw. Like, we knew this would be a different kind of conversation. And so I think it really was a highlight for me that so many people had that sort of orientation. Whereas I thought a divinity school might be a drawback for some people, it really seemed to be the thing that allowed for that freedom of thought and interdisciplinarity. Gosh, I mean, we had these incredible, huge name folks. Merlin Sheldrick obviously was an incredible person to have there, and I loved. On stage, I got to do this a little bit, but only later over drinks did I really understand. He has this incredible ongoing developing project thinking about Alfred Nord Whitehead and process thought and process theology as a way to make sense of fungal life. And so I'm really excited for him to develop that. And then, of course, we got to finish with Monica Gagliano, who's done so much to really push the question of science and the boundaries of science. And I think she was the perfect person to close because she kind of operates in these different modalities that one might call contemplative or transcendent, but also still identifies herself as a scientist. And so I feel like that really bookended the conference nicely. There's so much more I could say, but maybe I'll take a breath there. Yeah.
I know it's a difficult conference to summarize. There's so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate, I wonder about Merlin Sheldrake and his relationship to Whitehead, because I know
Uh-huh.
a colleague of mine, Matt Siegel, who I was at the California Institute of Integral Studies with, we were in grad school together. He's always, anytime anybody does anything, he's like, Whitehead would help. And so I feel like it might be that Matt was one, because I know he's been in conversation with Merlin. And so I feel like he was like, read Whitehead.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I'm not as big a fan of Whitehead as he is. I don't know if anybody is for that matter. He's obsessed. So yeah, I'm excited to see what else is coming out of Merlin's work. I also remember seeing a picture where his book Entangled Life, he inoculated with mushroom. That's such a great photo, and I think a good use of books is to inoculate them with mushrooms.
And
Um,
then eat them.
and then eat them. Yeah. And like that's such an afford, especially these days as like the cost of living is going up. I'm like, you could just grow mushrooms. It's a very affordable way to get a great source of nutrition and some protein
True.
um and I wonder, I mean, like you were saying, Rachel, about the fact that it's like you got scientists to come to a religious context and they were excited about that. I wonder if you could speak to the fact that this was also, like, conversely, this is the Center for the Study of World Religions talking about plants and fungi. And at Harvard of all places, because there's all kinds of like hippie schools, like like the California Institute of
We
Integral
won't name
Studies and whatnot.
names. Yeah.
And they're going to be happy to be like, the fungi are talking to us, man.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
for Harvard to do this seems pretty significant.
Yeah. And I also just want to this that raises a thought that I want to name, and Natalia has talked about this and worked on this, and so is our colleague Christine Webb. Is the fact that it's something we did in the reading group. We try to remind people is that science itself is ritualistic. Science itself is capitulating, like often implicitly, sometimes hiddenly, religious narratives or, metaphysical presumptions, just kind of naming that. I kind of did the thing where I was like, science, religion, juxtaposed. But obviously, we know that that is not the state of the discourse around science and religion in the academy right now. So I just want to like name that that's not, as stark of a contrast as I just parroted. But yeah, I think it just speaks to, I mean, I think it speaks to the kind of the fact that this initiative existed at Harvard and the CSWR. I think it does speak to kind of a dual impulse. I think at Harvard, we do want to be rigorous. And I think Natalia and I want to be rigorous. And that's why, as Natalia said, she pulled all these scientific articles from this book for folks to read. And so there really was a commitment to entering into disciplines on their own disciplinary terms and really trying to engage in good faith across the boundaries that we were exploring. Um, but also, I mean, the CSWR is kind of the heart of the weird at HDS.
Mhm.
Like, we're like, wow, HDS is doing plants and fungi. I'm like, no, 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 no. The Center for the Study of World Religions is doing plants and fungi. Not to say that there aren't folks like, Natalia mentioned Dan McCannon and the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality. But, like every large institution, it's not a monolith, right?
Right.
And I think that the CSWR has created the grounds for folks who might otherwise be kind of intellectual misfits or working in topics that might be seen as sort of cutting edge or a bit fringe. And so I think that's part of why we were situated there. I'm not sure if I really answered your question, but Natalia may have something to add there.
No, I don't think I have anything to add. That was really well said.
Mm.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I wonder to what extent the scientific community is becoming more accepting of the fact that science and religion aren't so separate. I feel like folks in the religious side of things are happy to be like, oh, we're doing science as well. But for scientists to admit that there's an element of religion there, and of course, these are kind of modern constructions of these categories. So, yeah, very complicated, but it does seem like it's moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. I mean, God, quantum physicists, I mean, their
Yeah.
shit is weird. Like, that's where
I
I'm
think,
like, I'm sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Natalia. Yeah, yeah. Go
Rachel, I
ahead.
think that's such a good point, right? And this is something that David Abram brought up our first year too. And we've talked about this a couple times. Well, first, also just to say we had scientists from different disciplines come to the reading group over the last couple years, and that was really interesting because also then we were, had the space to ask these questions about like, how does this land in your field? Or how are you thinking about ritual in your field? Or,
Right.
does the word consciousness even matter to you in this,
Right.
in this space? Um, but back to, this question on like quantum physics, why is it that those kind of questions can be asked in quantum physics, but when it comes to biology, we automatically say, no, 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 that's not appropriate. We have to look at the mechanics. And not to say that like, why is there like this level of anxiety around
Right.
the biology, but not that kind of anxiety around quantum physics or even like looking at astrophysics, looking at space. Why can we talk about these like large unknowns when we talk about space, but we can't talk about those large unknowns in even similar ways in biology without immediately being and when I say we, I'm looking more at I'm meaning to say like scientific literature in coming out of biological research that so many of the of scientists who ask those questions are written off, or they, talk about it in their personal journals or in their memoirs. But the minute that they engage with any of that kind of those life-changing moments in their science, it's again, it's unscientific. And that is a question that we kept coming up against, was this way in which there seems to be much more anxiety about language when it came to material coming out of biological research than there was in other spaces in scientific research, and that seems to be, I mean, this is, quite a very reductionist way of putting it, but it seems to be this like ongoing anxiety about souls that just
Mm.
like kept coming up over and over and over in the criticism of scientists, say like Suzanne Simard,
Right.
where, there this like language, these like polemics against her writing is much more about the language that she's using than about the data itself. And that
Mm.
seems to be not necessarily the case when you read someone talking about space.
Right.
And that's really interesting. And I think theological, actually. And we found, and I don't want to, speak for them. This may be, I hope this isn't inappropriate to say, but we found that many of the scientists who came into our space, and I don't mean that it feels like a really broad thing to say, the scientists who came into our
Right.
space, but like these people in different biological research spaces, at mostly at Harvard, but some at MIT and other spaces, like kept saying that, kept coming back to this, like, oh, this is so nourishing. Like
Mm.
this is giving me ways to think about my like the data that I'm seeing or the research that I'm doing, and I'm not, I haven't thought about it this way previously. And I think that comes back to this question of pedagogy and training and saying who's allowed to ask what questions and who's allowed to use what language. And also this supposed value-free objectivity that many of our colleagues are asked to have, but also this question of, can you even have that in these spaces? Can you walk into a lab and forget who you are or what your background is, or what you're going through, or what your belief system is? And that the pedagogy doesn't often include that, like many of the foundational people of science, and also people who continue to practice science, are religious or have spiritual commitments or have ideological commitments, even if those aren't religious.
Yep.
And that makes a difference in the kind of interpretation of data that they are producing for a wider public.
I
Yeah,
want to
it's
bring in, oh,
oh no,
I'm
please,
interrupting
Rachel.
you. Oh, you asked for interruptions. Here we go.
Yeah.
I want to bring in another layer that is being raised by what Natalia just said in terms of like anxieties around science's anxieties around the bounds of what it does. And you touched on this a little bit in terms of like the inability to truly be objective. The book we started, the first book we read in the whole series of the reading group, was Monica Gagliano's kind of career ending book, called Thus Spoke the Plant. And for folks who may not know, she currently identifies as, I think, a plant biologist, evolutionary ecologist. She does research with plants. And in this book, it's sort of a memoir, and she comes out and she says, actually, the plants told me how to design these experiments. So I'm a scientist, but actually they talked to me and they told me how to design this. And it was really interesting time for me to read that book, because I was concurrently in a seminar with Professor David Holland here at Harvard Divinity School called Writing About Revelation. And it was all looking at sort of religious figures who've experienced revelation, Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, you name it. And how do we, as scholars, understand the accounts of revelation that they give? How did they understand experiences of revelation? And when I read that book, I was like, oh, this is a revelatory text. Like, this is a woman who's a scientist saying, plants talked to me and they told me I needed to carry out this mission. The mission happened to be scientific experiments. And they also told me I need to tell you about it. And like, again, and she's very, there's people who there's a lot of controversy around her for many people, and we could definitely talk about that particular book for hours. But I think what's really interesting about her is she's doing something that, Indigenous peoples do all the time. And now there's this effort to kind of to create a sort of subcategory or like a type of science we're calling Indigenous science. But I feel like what's at the heart of that gesture is relationality. It's like I have a lived relationship with plants, and there's some mode of disclosure, be it revelatory, be it sort of just from like day-to-day life and knowledge and generational knowledge and myth and culture, that's giving me an understanding of these beings that don't fit the categories of like science, right? And so, yeah, that's something that really, this kind of question of other modes of knowing as well as relationship and the revelatory nature of relationship itself, that really grounded a lot of our discussions of like the boundary, our frustrations with the boundaries of science right now.
And boundaries of religion, I think.
In
They're
that religion.
similar anxieties in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
right. Because once you're questioning the boundaries of one, then the boundaries of the other are up for grabs.
Mm-hmm.
And for that matter, things like ethics and politics. And yeah, a lot of these distinctions that we take for granted, like, no, these were things built up at a specific moment in time, and
Mm-hmm.
it might be time to kind of reorganize those things. It's a
Totally.
funny thing doing religious studies when people are like, I don't even know if the category of religion makes sense. And it's
Yeah.
weird to be in a field where you question the very category of what you're doing. Yeah, so important. It's funny to call that Thus Spoke the Plant a career-ending book.
I mean, obviously she's doing very well. She's very prominent, but I think career ending in certain circles. I don't know, Natalia, if you'd agree with that, but I mean, we even had to sort of run interference a little bit at the conference in terms of like, there are different camps. There are just different
Right.
camps of plant scientists and how they think about her and situate her work. And I think personally, I have a lot of respect for her as a person. I think she's dynamic and daring and yeah, really amazing.
And she has a vocation, and that's,
Right.
that's something that we can really respect, I think, especially as religious studies scholars, is when you have a vocation. But I think also on the religious studies side, again, like to go back to this question of anxiety around souls,
Yeah.
and I'm kind of using that as a blanket term, but this like, the other side, which is the religious studies scholars or theologians in the room having anxiety about plants talking to a scientist. So you have the both sides of the disciplines that are sort of converging on Monica's work. And both, you have indigenous communities who might be saying, yeah, that is what's happening, or like we experience that as well. And again, indigenous communities are not a monolith. There's lots of ways that communities are interacting with landscapes and with the more than human worlds in which we all live in. But like it's this sort of a similar, she was just sort of she's like in the cross zone, she's
Yeah.
like in this space where she's talking about both and neither at the same time. And to have yeah, it was really, it's been really, really interesting. And also a complicated book. Even for someone who works in this space, I had moments where I was struggling with it. But I think she carries her curiosity and her commitment to her work with such grace, but also with such like, she so
Fiction.
believes in it. Yeah, conviction. Thank you. That's
Mm,
exactly the way.
Yeah.
She is so committed to the cause. It's such a vocation that I think it's like, you have to it is revelatory even for the listener or the reader, because you have to sit back and listen and hear what she has to say.
So yeah.
yeah, I especially appreciate the kind of allusion to Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra,
Yeah.
because it was kind of the idea that, like, well, whatever we call Western civilization has kind of run its course, and there's got to be some new kind of guiding principle. And what if it's not Zarathustra? What if it turns out to be the plant? I think that's yeah, just a great title. In terms of titles, it's really hard to beat that title.
Yeah.
And I appreciate, I mean, that seems to be one of the great highlights of the conference is that you were able to really engage in some of the most serious tensions of our time in terms of religion, science, our ethical and political relationships to plants and fungi, and to do it in a way where some people had their feathers ruffled and some people felt it very nourishing. I mean, that's like that seems like the ideal conference, and also the fact that people had time for community building.
Mm.
Because that is such, I've become pretty disenchanted about conferences. Friends of mine know this, and they're like, no, it's things where people like read their paper and just leave
Yeah.
and then write that line on their CV, and then that's that. And times where people actually get to build community is just so special. Well, one extra question. I mean, I have many, but I'm not going to keep you for several hours. But I have friends for whom, if you say that you're thinking with fungi, they have assumptions. And they're going to think that you, of course, are probably talking about psilocybin mushrooms.
Mm.
The fact that Michael Pollan, of course, was a part of your reading group for a minute, and his book, How to Change Your Mind about psychedelics, and some of his earlier stuff like Botany of Desire, where he brings up cannabis. So, plants and fungi, it sounds like people are smoking weed and doing mushrooms. And so, were psychedelics at all a part of the conversation or no? Because obviously in academia, that's still a pretty marginalized subject, like less so now than like 20 years ago. I think especially maybe research in ayahuasca has become more popular. But still, it's still a little anathema. And you can plead the fifth. You don't have to say anything.
I think actually it would be the opposite. I have too much to say. Um, Rachel, do you want to respond first?
I mean, I'll speak briefly, and then I really appreciate what Natalia has to say on this topic as an herbalist and someone who has relationship with, let us say, quieter plants and fungi. Yeah, I mean, so practically speaking, this is a very boring administrative answer, but to my point about the CSWR housing these kind of like intellectually orphan initiatives, there's a whole initiative at the CSWR dedicated to psychedelics and the future of religion. So even on a very kind of practical level, we felt like there's a lot of real estate in
Mhm.
that conversation already at Harvard. And so just even thinking about the types of speakers we, invite, many of them have already been invited to that conference, which has been running for 3 years now. There's a reading group there. So I think our hope was to, I mean, we don't eschew it. We don't like put the kibosh on it. I've written about psychedelics. I have experience with them. I think they're interesting, but I think there's a level of discourse that we wanted to get to that's not evident in those circles
Right.
necessarily. And I'll let Natalia say more about the many things she has to say on this topic.
I'll try to be brief. I think Rachel actually said it quite well, is that it's already there's already so much that isn't necessarily what we wanted to devote time and energy towards. I think first and foremost, I would just say I'm ambivalent about a lot of it. Which feels maybe reductive in some way, but it is how I feel. I think part of it has to do with that. I understand, especially in these highly industrialized, exhausting, very, this framework that so many of us are living in the so-called Western world, westernized, industrialized world where so many people I hear and this deep disconnection, but also this like sort of, this like lack of I don't know if imagination is the right word, but this difficulty in seeing mind in the more than human. And that, I've had conversations with folks who do research at Burning Man or who are at Burning Man or who are at other spaces as well, who go on ayahuasca retreats regularly, that like this is a way in which to enter into those spaces that allow them to have these kind of relationships. It's like the jump start in some ways. I feel really I have a lot of difficulty with that for a few reasons. One, I just and maybe this is a product of my own enchanted upbringing. I don't know. I don't mean to, but like it's it doesn't seem that hard to me to see the world as deeply alive. And I feel like if you have to, I feel like there are so many of the plants that we see that are being commodified as spiritual experiences have really deep and long traditions in communities with whom they evolved alongside. And we see them being completely extracted from those spaces and put into whether that's like synthesized then into a lab space where someone's doing doing working with psilocybin in a closed room with a single psychologist with curated lights, or on the other side, an ayahuasca retreat in Queens. Like I just it's so divorced from the tradition and from the context that I have a difficult time with it, partially because I think that there's some very deep appropriation that's occurring a lot of the time.
Mhm.
And also I think that it's often again divorced from what relationship to land really looks like, which is really hard and really complicated and takes a ton of work and is like a daily practice. It's not you go and have a spiritual awakening on a weekend. It is a you are out every day looking at how beautiful and brutal everything is in a garden space or in a forest or in a park, and engaging with that on this like on this emotional, but like maybe I should say like phenomenological level, because it's so many, it's not just emotional, it's somatic, it's just all over the place. And so
Right.
and it involves then your literary stuff too, or your spiritual practices. So it just doesn't feel like it can be so isolated as what the contemporary psychedelics conversation makes it out to be. And that is where I tried to, or I have tried in my space as a um, guide or facilitator to steer from those conversations, to say those are all welcome and interesting in other spaces. There's plenty of places you can go to explore that. But here we're going to look more at what does relationship look like.
Mhm.
And if and there are plenty of cultures in which relationship includes working with entheogenic plants. But there's also tons of plants who aren't entheogenic, who are just as capable and interested in relationship. And we should be just as capable and interested in them and have relationships with them, just because they aren't the ones that are like going to give you, a weekend uh, escape from your life, or like a jump start into a spiritual awakening, doesn't mean that those aren't also equally valuable relationships, and they just get overlooked in the psychedelics conversation.
Really well said. I can't imagine saying that better. For folks who don't know, right, psychedelics, sometimes called entheogens, and theos means the God within, so it generates God inside of you. So it's like a mystical experience. To me, it's not that there are plants that aren't entheogenic, it's that they're not necessarily psychoactive. And so, is there a plant that's not an entheogen? Like a redwood entheogen, right? Aren't they all?
Love that.
But so
Love
yeah,
that.
no, really appreciate that. And especially, I mean, geez, talking about Harvard of all places, where Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, then Ram Dass, and their student Ralph Metzner, who's a teacher of mine. And so the legacy of psychedelics at Harvard is complicated. But yeah, great answers. I had a student a couple of years ago who did her senior thesis on ayahuasca, and specifically on how capitalism and tourism and the extractive industry are just ruining whatever that plant had to teach people. So I appreciate that. Or Caitlin Reed had a book come out a couple of years ago called Green Gold, and it's about how the cannabis industry is hurting Northern California.
Yeah.
So yeah, really appreciate that. It's important to be critical of those things and to lift up all the plants that are not seen as super important or valuable or as teachers.
Yeah.
Uh,
And
well,
Sam, can I interject really
oh
quickly?
yes,
I'm
please.
talking so much, but like I think it's also equally then important to say I don't want anyone who's gone through this incredible spiritual experience to feel like that's diminished, because
Right.
that I think it's also really important to validate that these are powerful, powerful experiences. But then we have to find also ways to then integrate It's like to leave it as just a weekend, I think is where a lot of the danger is, rather than to figure out how what that integration looks like. And I just have not found that a lot of spaces that offer these opportunities find also then ways to integrate those opportunities afterwards, and in the long term. So that's sort of I think my end point with it is like, I don't want to diminish someone's religious experience or to reduce it to like, you engaged in extractive, like I
Yeah.
don't want to do that either. But I do want to be mindful of the systems that allow for that kind of behavior to be economically, popular,
Mhm.
without giving people the chance to then say, okay, now I can engage with the pine trees. Like what does that look like long term? What does it look like to be in relationship with my local park or with the forest down the street or something along those lines?
Mhm.
Yeah, no, very, very well said. Yeah, it reminds me of like some folks in transpersonal psychology would say it's not about having altered states, it's about cultivating altered traits.
Hmm.
And so you want to have an enduring practice, an enduring relationship, and not just, kind of blow wide open on the weekend. And you're like, oh, I got to be God on Saturday. Anyway, going back to my normal life. So yeah, integration is really the name of the game. So yeah, so I guess it's a separate conversation. I appreciate also that the Center for the Study of World Religions is engaging with that, and yeah, really cool stuff happening there in general. And I'm very envious. Here's the thing I also want to know, and this is sometimes I get how can you not get pessimistic? We're on track this year to emit the most carbon dioxide ever globally, beating the previous record, which was last year,
Why
which
does
we,
this every year we have the same headline? It's like,
yeah, yeah, exactly.
I think at this
We
point,
keep breaking those records.
it's because
And
we're
so,
not stopping the growth economy. Like, this is a natural consequence. Yeah.
I think of this with like studies into like ethological studies into animal consciousness, like in the 1970s, animal rights movement, animal welfare. 50 years later, biodiversity loss is increasing
Yeah.
rapidly. And so I feel like somehow identifying intelligence or sentience or consciousness in plants and animals and fungi, it it doesn't seem to be stopping the crisis. And sometimes I worry that it might even be like some kind of salve where we go, oh, don't worry, we know that they're conscious. Anyway, because of that, we feel like morally allowed to keep our destructive industrial growth economy going. So like is this kind of work like to what extent is like the conference that you put on helping to push people to actually make the changes in their lives and their communities and their social systems to actually make the world a better place? Because it seems like that's happening, I should say. I think that's what's happening, especially the two of you. I'm like, yeah, we're making a difference. And it's not just another conference where people get to, I mean, just like we're saying with psychedelics, you go to a conference for a weekend and then you get home and you maintain your normal lifestyle as a consumer. And, so I just worry that the new trend for talking about plant and fungal intelligence is going to do the same thing that animal intelligence did in the 70s, where it's not really going to move the needle, or maybe it did move the needle more than I'm saying. I don't know. This is just me being like sometimes I get pessimistic, and so cheer me up.
Oh, I'm going to give you even more. Is it a more pessimistic answer? Well, okay. Firstly, I kind of like put in my time in the DC environmental policy circuit, and like burning out from that and becoming so pessimistic about that is what
Mm,
drove me to divinity school. And one thing I will say, like, as much as I'm a champion for deeply relational, attuned confrontations with the more than human world, leaving open the possibility of their radical alterity, their intelligence, their sentience, their umwelt, I will say some of the most effective champions I know and I knew in DC are working from a very instrumental perspective. Some of the most effective lobbyists I knew were like, hey, look, trees store like X gigatons of carbon per dollar. They're the cheapest form of carbon sequestration technology we have. And like, even though there's part of me that can do the sort of like academic leftist pessimist thing that's like, that's still an extractive logic, like we need to get away from that. It funneled a lot of interest and money into conservation, right? So there's part of me that's always a bit of a pragmatist on this front, where I'm like, whatever gets us there, right? Even though I have my own personal commitments and like my own, like, I just find the world much more interesting and vibrant to imagine it ensouled and alive. And I want to live in that world and come to know that world. But there are tons of folks who are fighting a really good fight and they're not in that world. So like, what do I do about that? Right.
Mhm.
And you will notice in the initiative, we try to stay away from like messianic language of like thinking with plants and fungi will solve the ecological crisis. We have some light language around like inviting new modes of thought or like reconsidering. Um, but I think, yeah, I guess the metaphor that I would give for this, and it's a very pessimistic metaphor, which is like, imagine that the person you loved most in this life was dying and you spent like all the time by their all the time running around talking to their doctors and trying to get them better care. Meanwhile, you're not sitting next to them as they're dying to get to know, like maybe you realize you don't know their favorite song. You don't know their deepest regret. You don't know their deepest longing. Like for me, that's been my evolution, was like I feel like I was running around the hospital trying to save a dying planet, like a dying patient. And it was like, you haven't even really put in the time to think, to sit, to contemplate, to get to know the world and its like radiant, shining aliveness, right? And I think I would rather do that, given
Mm.
that, and I don't mean to like eschew large scale collective action. I don't mean to eschew political advocacy. I just think that these things are often orthogonal. And there's like a resonance there with some of the language around like mystical experience necessarily makes you a more ethical person, right?
Right.
We have tons of counterfactuals that that is not necessarily true. Like insight of a certain flavor does not necessarily map onto a certain politics. So to me, you need both. Like you need, I think you need the sort of awakening to the natural world, and you need the nitty gritty of like community organizing and putting pressure on companies and governments. And those things aren't necessarily going to easily map onto one another. And I think the risk is a wishful thinking where we think that they will, where it's like, ah, if I just did more ayahuasca, or if I just observed a flower or read this study on how plants are conscious, that will magically necessarily lead to the very difficult work of shifting supply chains, of like shifting governance, right? So yeah, I think you need both. And I don't think we have any sort of messianic understanding that what we're doing in the initiative is necessarily going to change the world. But I do believe in helping people wake up to this life and like the radiant possibility of relationship that's on the table. But many of us leave it on the table because we don't know how to see it and engage it. Um, yeah.
That's great. No, that's yeah, really great answer. And I don't think that metaphor was too pessimistic. I mean, it's kind of like dark. It's a little more it's a little morbid maybe, but also very beautiful to be like, well, don't forget to spend time with your dying loved one. And and that's not like a replacement for medical treatment. But, ameliorative care is important, and it might wake you up to some more possibilities that'll help you communicate with the doctors more. But in any case, when all is said and done, the biggest regret would be not spending time. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think that, people who pay attention to this podcast know I talk a lot about my cat, and she's been into the hospital a couple times in the last couple of years. And last year it was so bad that the vet tech was like, euthanasia is an option. I was like, what? You're coming at me with that? I was like, no, we'd like her to get better, please. And so she's on a lot of meds for basically heart disease, liver disease, and hyperthyroidism. So she's got some problems. She's about 12 years old. But one of the things that's changed is now like every moment I spend with her is so much more of a blessing because you realize, this isn't something you get to take for granted. And so the more that we can appreciate all of the more than human world, and of course, in this case, plants and fungi, and then you look at the world around you and you realize what a miracle is, what a blessing it is. And it's like, well, is this helping with my activism? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's making my life a lot better and making my relationships better. And so it's just really remarkable that something like this is happening at all. but also the fact that stuff like this is happening in the form of an academic conference. And so I know anybody I've talked to, I know everybody at the Forum on Religion and Ecology, that we've just been so excited about this kind of work. We're like, can you believe it? It's happening at Harvard at an academic conference, and the fact that this kind of stuff is bubbling up is just so marvelous. So big thanks to both of you for making this happen, because I know I've only done a little conference organizing in my life, and it's ridiculously complicated. And I don't have much of an administrative mindset too, so I'm just like, I don't know, just invite people to show up. It'll work its way out, and but it's actually very difficult. So big thanks, and again, I could talk to you forever about this, but I think that's probably enough. And the way I like to end episodes lately is to give everybody a chance to give like a word or a phrase to kind of take us out. And I saw a tail wagging in the background, Rachel, which I absolutely love. Uh, perfect timing.
She has a final word she'd like to.
It seems like it. So yeah, a word or a phrase. And since it's both of you, I'll say Natalia, you go first, and then Rachel, you give us a final word or phrase. Sometimes I ask people to do that. They give me a run-on sentence, and that's okay too. But something could be anything whatsoever. But I think that's a fun way to close out the episode. So I know it's a lot of pressure. It's a big assignment. So Natalia, you, you don't seem super happy about it.
No, I got one. I got one.
Okay, what do you got?
I uh do you also want us to give an explanation of why or just the word?
No explanation needed. Just a word or a phrase.
All right, the word would be world building.
Wonderful. Rachel, what do you have for us?
Yeah, mine's going to be an imperative verb followed by an adverb. Live creaturely. Live as a creature, live creaturely.